Okay, great. We're live on Facebook now, folks.
Greetings and welcome to our second annual Catholic Nonviolence Initiative series. I warmly welcome students and faculty and those who are viewing through our live stream, and also to those who will be watching this recording later on. This series promotes the mission and the goals of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. The Catholic Nonviolence Initiative is a project of Pax Christi International, and it seeks to raise awareness of and our understanding of nonviolence as a strategy, a way of life, and a key part of our faith. The series is hosted by Casa Esther Catholic Worker House in Amro, Wisconsin. We are located on the original homeland of the Ho-Chunk Nation, also known as the People of the Sacred Voice. I also want to acknowledge that today we observe the birth date of Mahatma Gandhi, one of the greatest practitioners and teachers of nonviolence from the 20th century. Last year's series was on gospel nonviolence and its application to today's church and world, as seen through the work, research, and writings of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. For this year, we chose the theme of nonviolence and care for creation. This series aims to explore a crucial connection between violence and the climate crises, emphasizing that nonviolent pathways are the best way to a sustainable integral ecology. And the foundation for this thought-provoking series is rooted in Catholic social teaching, and it is inspired by Pope Francis's encyclical from 2015, Laudato Si', and from his visionary perspective on active nonviolence needed to nurture a harmonious relationship between humanity and our planet. Tonight, we are discussing the theological foundations of environmental justice. Next week, we will look at some real-life examples of environmental violence. The third week, we look at war and defense spending and how that impacts our environment and the poor. And on the fourth week, we have a panel discussion of young climate activists. Finally, on the fifth week, we will be looking at the efforts of the church in proposing solutions to this crisis. We hope that you will join us each Monday evening, and we also invite you to invite your friends and colleagues, because we will keep Registration open for the entire month. Without going any further, I'm happy to introduce to you two colleagues who with me planned and organized this series over the past 7 months. Lilian Ehidiamhen, and Lilian is a peace activist and a consultant on gender responsive policies with a background in peace and security and environmental justice. She is a member of the Pax Christi's Young Adult Caucus. And Michelle Sherman. Michelle is the project director for nonviolence and campus outreach for Pax Christi USA. She is on the leadership team for the Pax Christi Young Adult Caucus, and she is also an adjunct professor at the University of Dayton in Ohio. You will see more of them in the coming weeks. Also on our team is my friend of many years, Jorge Dr. Lero, who will be doing all the editing of the recordings of these events. One final comment to keep in mind during this entire series. As Pope Francis so powerfully articulated in his encyclical Laudato Si', the cry of the earth is inseparable from the cry of the poor. The poorest, most vulnerable people on our planet are bearing the brunt of the catastrophic effects of the ecological crises we find ourselves in. This connection of the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor might not be explicitly expressed by each panelist of this series, but it is always implied. Now, before we move into tonight's presentation, I'd like to take a moment for us to turn to prayer this evening. And this prayer is taken from Laudato Si'. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. Teach us to discover the worth of every created thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with each creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day and being with us tonight. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen. I am so thrilled to begin our program. We are so fortunate to have wonderful dynamic panelists and a wonderful moderator for tonight's event, who is Lilian Ehidiamhen. Lilian currently is a religious education student at St. Mary's University, Twickenham, London. She majors in theological ethics with specific interest in Catholic social teaching, peace ethics, ethics of communication, African social issues, and liberation theology and social transformation. Her research focuses on how Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication can contribute to Catholic social teaching on peace and address the violent conflicts in Nigeria and contribute to peace building globally. I welcome Lilian, and Lilian, I'll turn it over to you. Tell us where you're coming from and what time of the night it is.
Thank you so much, David, for introducing me to moderate this event. I'm currently in Twickenham, London. It's after 12 a.m. and the weather is very cold at this moment. So, just a quick rundown of our event today. We are going to be hearing from 3 speakers. And each of the speakers will be speaking for 15 minutes. So our first speaker is Emmanuel Katongole. He is a professor of theology and peace studies at the University of Notre Dame, where he serves as a full-time faculty of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Before joining the University of Notre Dame in January 2013, he served as Associate Professor of Theology and World Christianity at Duke University and is the founding co-director of the Duke Center for Reconciliation. His most recent book is Who Are My People? Love, Violence, and Christianity in Sub-Saharan Africa. Notre Dame Press, 2022. At Notre Dame, he coordinates an interdisciplinary research project which investigates how religious and secular forces compete or collaborate in shaping new modes of authority, community, and identity within the context of nation-state modalities in Africa. He is a Catholic priest of Kampala Archdiocese, Uganda, where he was ordained in 1987. Dr. Katongole earned a PhD in philosophy from the Catholic University of Leuven. So, Prophet Emmanuel Katongole, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Lilian, and happy to see you again. Thank you, David. Thank you, Michelle, and all the other your colleagues who have organized this event and for inviting me. I'm indeed honored to be on the panel together with my friends, David and Anna. It's indeed an incredible joy for me to be here this evening and to share a few thoughts, reflections on theological foundation for environmental justice. As Lilian introduced me, I've been really working, teaching in the areas of politics and violence and theology in Africa. I worked at the Center for Reconciliation, founded the Center for Reconciliation at Duke University, then moved to Notre Dame. I've been involved in various research activities and teaching as well, really on issues connected to violence. But I can tell you, it is 2015, reading Pope Francis's encyclical letter Laudato Si, that brought everything, these different aspects of my research and my concern together. And I do remember exactly when I first read it. I think it was in December that I first read it. I had put it aside for the summer. And I was, of course, impressed by the simple, accessible style, by the urgency of the cry of the earth that he was pointing to, but also by the connection that he was making between the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. The social and the ecological go together. They cannot be separated. However, the most profound statement that I found in Laudato Si was the observation that he makes early on in paragraph 2 about the underlying spiritual wound. And that's where I want to begin my reflection of the theological foundations for environmental justice. It begins by recognizing that underlying the social and ecological crisis of our time is a spiritual wound. Pope Francis connects this spiritual wound to our inability to see ourselves deeply connected to the earth. It is a crisis of belonging. We have forgotten what it means to belong to the earth, he says. We no longer see ourselves connected. We forget that we are made from dust. So that is the underlying crisis. It's a spiritual crisis. And unless that spiritual crisis is addressed, all our efforts, environmental justice and advocacy, unless they are able to get to the heart of the crisis, which is spiritual, they are going to fall short of what it takes to address those social and ecological challenges of our time. That wound, according to Pope Francis, the wound, the spiritual wound, is in a way connected and grows out of what he describes as a distorted anthropocentrism, a distorted anthropology, a distorted way in which we look at ourselves. We see human beings as the center, and we see creation as out there, and understand everything to be just at the service of human interest. That's what he describes as that distorted anthropocentrism, a misleading anthropology. And for Francis, that misleading anthropology has been greatly advanced, promoted through, as he describes it, the technocratic paradigm, the technocratic way of looking at things. The problem is not technology. The technocratic paradigm is a technological mindset. It's a mindset that sees nature as just an external object out there, mere nature, that has no goal in itself, that has no telos, except to serve human interest. Sees nature just as an object of utility, an object that can be manipulated, exploited. It's almost a kind of nature as a raw material, as a resource. And these are different kind of insights that he kind of throws around in Laudato Si, that are connected to the technological paradigm, technocratic paradigm, that way of looking at reality. What, as I read Laudato Si, what Laudato Si is calling for is that we need a new outlook away from the technocratic paradigm, a new outlook. And this outlook is what he describes as an integral ecology. Again, like the technocratic paradigm, integral ecology is not a thing. It's not even a policy recommendation. It is a mindset. It is a way of looking at the world, of looking at things. It is an outlook. And in paragraph 111, he also describes it as a lifestyle and a spirituality. It's all connected, but as an outreach. And distinctive of this outreach, of this outlook, that it sees the interconnectedness of everything and how everything is connected and how we human beings are also connected. So really, it is an alternative outlook, an alternative paradigm to the technocratic paradigm. A paradigm that invites us to see the deep interconnectedness of everything else. For Pope Francis, at the basis of this integral ecology paradigm is a theological anthropology, a theological view of human beings. This is at the basis of this integral ecology. And this outlook, this theological anthropology, sees and recognizes that all human life is grounded in three relationships: relationship with God, relationship with one another, and relationship with the earth, with creation. So these are intertwined relationships. These are interconnected relationships, but there are three distinct relationships: with God, with the community, and with the earth itself. In paragraph 66. If any of those is broken, the rest suffer. Now that's what has happened, according to Pope Francis, out of this technocratic paradigm. So what we need to recover is this integral ecology, at the basis of which there is this rich theological anthropology that sees this interconnected relationship between God, between ourselves, and between the created world here. A biblical foundation is what supports this anthropology. So that's now how we get into this, what I call the foundational principles of integral ecology that are grounded within this biblical framework. And so Pope Francis in chapter 2 shifts our reading of the account of creation from the overemphasis and reliance on chapter 1 that we have often used to point to the Genesis chapter 2. And this is where a good reading of Genesis 2 can provide us with some, at least 5 basic insights, foundational insights of this integral ecology. First of all, as we meet God in Genesis chapter 2, we see God working with his hands, our hands, creating everything. The heavens and the earth are the work of God's hands. They are created by God. So creation, therefore, is deeply, intimately connected to God. It has value in itself, and so it is love between God and God's creation. That's the first principle. God intimately connected with his creation, creation belonging to God. The second foundational principle from this story of the creation of the world and everything, the creation account, is that man himself is fashioned out of the soil. Thus, man's identity is deeply connected not only to the Maker God, but to the earth. God formed man, Adam in Hebrew, from the dust, Adama, that deep interconnectedness between humans and the soil. The third principle out of this story, inside out of this story, you can see that God actually plants a garden in verse 8 of chapter 2 in the east, in Eden. Eden, which means delight. And there he puts man he had formed, and God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing again to the eye and good for food. It kind of brings up this idea of the beauty, the abundance, the variety, but also the delightful nature of creation. Creation delights God. God is delighted in God's creation. God takes delight in his creation. As we see also in Genesis chapter 1, when at every end of the day of creation, God says, it is good. You can almost see God smiling. The fourth element that I see coming out of this biblical story is man's vocation. That God now takes the man and puts him in the Garden of Eden. And the translation, there are many translations of this, is to work it and keep it. This is in verse 15. But this notion of working it and keeping it is translated differently. Some translation point to put him in the garden to till and take care of it. But the original words that are used in Hebrew is abad and shama. These words, their roots, as many biblical scholars, Ellen Davis and others are pointing out, can be used with ambivalent meanings. Abad, that is usually translated as to till and to cultivate, can also actually mean to work it. God put man in the garden to work it, or to work for it. So there is that element also, not only tilling, but to serve the land, the soil. And shama, which is usually translated as to care for it, can also be translated, used to mean to preserve or even to observe. certainly this is far from the dominion mentality that many of us have usually associated with the creation account in Genesis chapter 1. What it points to is to an intimate relationship of love, of care, of service, of cultivating, of nurturing. It's actually a form of mothering. Here one can find a lot of connections with what the environmentalist Vandana Shiva calls mothering. There is almost a kind of a mutual mothering. The more can mother the earth, the more the earth mothers us as well. But it is this man's vocation in a way to serve the land and to work for the land as well. The fifth foundational principle that one can get out of the story of Genesis chapter 2 is that then God says in verse 18, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helpmate. And so the story continues. Here you can see the foundation of the human community in a way that is deeply connected also with the story of creation, community, a companionship. So the elements of God's creation, God loves the creation, and the creation is intrinsically good, has value in itself, man's own identity, creation as delightful, the sense of the man's vocation, and the sense of community. They can all be in a way established from this creation story of Genesis chapter 2. So in conclusion, I can see that the key to addressing the spiritual wound that lies at the heart of our social and ecological crisis, according to Pope Francis, is an invitation into an integral ecology. An integral ecology that forms that intimate bond and the deep sense of belonging, this sense of connection between God, humans, and the earth. And the account of Genesis chapter 2 is a good place to start for us to get into this integral ecology. So that's what I can say as by way of introduction to some of these foundational principles of environmental justice. Thank you very much. And I think my time is up.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel Katongole, for this inspiring presentation, for reminding us of the need to reconnect ourselves to creation through integral ecology. So we now invite our second presenter, Daniel Castillo, is Associate Professor of Theology at Loyola University, Maryland. Daniel teaches and researches in eco-theology, environmental ethics, and liberation theology. He is the author of an ecological theology of liberation, salvation, and political ecology, Orbis Books 2019, which features a foreword by Gustavo Gutierrez, and earned the College Theology Society's Best Book Award in 2020. His forthcoming book is titled Confronting the Age of Cain, Christian Faith in the Anthropocene. Dr. Castillo earned his PhD in theology from the University of Notre Dame in 2014. So, Daniel Castillo, you have 15 minutes to share your reflection with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lily. So, thank you, everyone, and thank you to all the organizers. We were asked to say a bit about how we came to our work as we begin to reflect on do the work of theology here. And so, there's many things that I could say. I will just briefly note that something that brought me to my work, a pivotal moment in my life, was the 2 years I spent, the first year as a Jesuit volunteer, living in St. Louis and teaching in East St. Louis at an alternative high school there. And there, in the bodies and psyches of my students, I confronted on a daily basis the realities, the lived realities of environmental racism. Numerous students, and nearly all of the students, were suffering from chronic illnesses that I had never seen in a population of 17 or 18-year-olds before. And so this was something that I took with me from my time there. And really one of the things it prompted in me, so what I was witnessing, right, what I would describe it is the political, ecological, or eco-social effects of sin. And so this prompted in me questions of how to understand and respond. How do we understand and respond to who God is and what God desires in light of phenomena such as environmental racism, in light of the political, ecological dimensions of sin and grace? So it's appropriate that with our time here today, I'll consider some of these themes. In doing so, I won't look at the historical or the phenomenological so much as the symbolic, the way in which the political, ecological dimensions of sin and grace are mediated through the narratives and symbols of Scripture. And here then I will be building on some of what Father Katongole has laid out for us. Let me just share screen. Okay. Let me pick up where Father Katongole left off, and thinking about, just briefly, Genesis 2, right? So the fundamental view there is that, as Emmanuel noted so beautifully, is that God creates the human person to be in intimate and loving communion with God, neighbor, and earth, and calls humanity to preserve those bonds of intimacy, those bonds of love, those bonds of communion through serving and caring for the soil and all that comes from the soil. And so we can name that symbolically the vocation, the call of God, the vocation of gardener. And this image here, as well as good as any image I've come across, captures that intimacy and that threefold love and that closeness. So just take a second to consider the image, consider where our lives may participate in this kind of posture, where our lives pull us in ways that look very different from this. And of course, our lives in many ways do look different than that. And that's because in the story doesn't stop with Genesis 2, but moves into the narration of sin and the introduction of violence and abuse into history and into human life and into the life of the world, into the life of creation. So I just want to say a few words, kind of pick up on this story that continues on through Genesis 4 to narrate some of this and look at the theological foundations here. If the call was to serve and care, what we're introduced to in Genesis 3 is the temptation to reject that vocation. The tree of knowledge of good and evil kind of takes center stage, and the serpent comes and offers it to humanity. And what's telling here, right, so this isn't just knowledge for the sake of knowledge, I would suggest, but the description of the serpent who becomes associated with this tree is important to note. The serpent is described as cunning or shrewd. And that language shows up later on in the Pentateuch when Pharaoh, the great enslaver, the great oppressor, the first words from his mouth are, "Come, let us deal shrewdly with them," with the Hebrews. And from there, domination unfolds, oppression unfolds, marginalization unfolds, abuse unfolds. And so the serpent here being described as cunning, as shrewd, and tied to this tree, connected to this tree, suggests that this is the type of knowledge being offered here. And in fact, the Christian tradition has long interpreted this drama precisely along those lines. That when humanity internalizes the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, in effect they are saying they're rejecting God's vocation. God says, serve and care, and humanity says, I will not serve. Right? Moreover, the soil and all that comes from the soil will serve me. I will be like God. And so here, humanity refuses to continue to cultivate and care, refuses to preserve those bonds in the way God intended, fully in the way that God intended. And we see that sin not only wounds the humanity's relationship with God and with one another, but with the earth itself, again, with the soil and all that is formed from the soil in the Yahwist's imagination, in the imagination of the author of Genesis 2 through 4. And so again here, we see the political, ecological dimensions of sin starting to unfold in their nascent form, right? That it is not just, again, a social reality, it's not just a reality between one and God, but it's the whole of creation is affected by sin. This threefold sense of alienation emerges. And if this emerges in Genesis 3, it takes even a sharper turn in the story that follows of Cain and Abel, which Pope Francis reflects on in a profound way in Laudato Si. So the story of Cain and Abel, actually, there is a note of hope at the very beginning of this. After the loss that's narrated through the fall, through the banishment from the Garden of Eden, well, first of all, we're told that a new generation emerges, which that in of itself is a sign of hope. But also we're told that Cain is a servant of the soil. He's abiding the soil. And Abel, the second son, is a keeper of sheep. A shepherd, it gets translated, but it's actually a shamarer of sheep. So here in this new generation, the vocation intended for humanity from the beginning is passed down. There's a chance that however impaired we are with sin, we can continue to do the work of the gardener, continue to participate in God's divine call to serve and care for the soil and all that comes from the soil. At the same time that this note of hope is introduced, though, we're immediately confronted with some worrying notes, worrying tones. And this comes in the names of the two brothers. Cain's name means many things, but for our purposes here, I will just note two of them. Cain's name connotes spear or metal worker. And Abel's name means alternatively vapor, nothingness, worthlessness. And I would suggest to you that this connects well with what Gustavo Gutierrez in his work on liberation theology names as the non-person. The human who is fully human, who is created in the image of and likeness of God, but in the eyes of the world, in the eyes of society, functionally exist as less than human, functionally exist as non-person. And so here we have Cain, the firstborn son, who expects to be exalted, who expects to be at the center, and Abel, the second-born son, who in the eyes of his culture, in the eyes of the world, would have been relatively nothingness, worthlessness, vapor. And so as this story unfolds, what we find is God is actually making a preferential option for the poor. God finds the one who is named as nothingness, that one's offering to be pleasing, and in effect elevates the one who is oppressed, the one who is taken to be of no account. And what we see happen here is Cain, who again, in his privilege and his presumption, expects to be at the center, expects to be celebrated, when he finds that his brother now has been elevated perhaps to equal or even preferred standing to him. he experiences, it unleashes lust for domination again, profound resentment, profound rage, and he leads his brother out into the fields that Cain ought to be serving and caring, and kills his brother. Subsequently, Cain, the metal worker, the spear maker, flees God, flees the soil, and goes off to build the first city. And here it is worth, if the vocation of gardener is symbolic to connote the work of service and care, city here also functions in a symbolic way. It is not urban space per se, but it's better understood in terms, as the classic kind of understanding from Augustine, as civilization, or more germane and slightly more pointed for our work here today, we can think of the city that Cain builds as a
Hi, Lilian. I brought you back on because it looks like Dan's screen froze. And so we've either lost him or else he's lost his signal.
Wow. I'm wondering, it seems he's out of the space.
Mm-hmm.
I'm back, but I can't unmute myself. Am I unmuted? Okay.
Yes.
Welcome back.
Sorry about that, everyone. If you can allow me to share my screen again, I will just pick up and push through.
Go ahead, Dan. You should have screen sharing privileges now.
Okay. So if we think of the city that Cain builds as a system of political ecology, what we find here then is that the world is now being shaped by structural sin. That's the sin of Cain, the alienation from God, from neighbor, from earth, is now taking social form, taking cultural forms, taking political economic forms. And this narrates the world that we live in. This describes the world that we live in. I will pass through Francis's comment on this. I'll just read the second half of it in green. Francis, reflecting on the story of Cain and Abel, says, "Disregard for the duty to cultivate and maintain a proper relationship with my neighbor for whose care and custody I am responsible ruins my relationship with my own self, with others, with God, and with the earth. When all these relationships are neglected, when justice no longer dwells in the land, the Bible tells us life itself is endangered." If thus far I've narrated the political ecological dimensions of sin, what do we say about salvation? Here I would just point you to Isaiah's famous prophecy, vision of peace, vision of salvation, where he says, "On the day when God reigns, God will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore." Recall here the name of Cain and Cain's original vocation. Cain, the cultivator of the soil, ostensibly had the tools of service and care, the plowshare and the pruning hook. But Cain, in his pride, in his resentment, in his selfishness, in his hard-heartedness, takes those, and as metal worker, takes the tools of service and care and transforms them into the weapons of domination, into the sword, and again, his namesake, the spear. Isaiah's vision then of peace, of salvation, God's invitation to us, the work of the gardener is to take the structures of Cain, to take the lifestyles of Cain, to take the violence that infects our world in political, ecological ways, and transform those structures into the structures of service and care, to re-inhabit the vocation of gardener, which I would suggest to you is the image of God at its fullness. And so here, just to leave you with an illusion, it's perhaps not accidental, perhaps it's, as N.T. Wright says, the right kind of mistake that Mary in the resurrection account, the first resurrection account in John, mistakes Jesus as the gardener. Because Jesus, in fact, is the gardener, the one who shows the fullness of the image of God, the one who shows how to serve and care, the one who renews creation and undoes the world shaped so profoundly by the forces that Cain exemplifies. So the work of beating plowshares or swords and spears into plowshares and pruning hooks is not just the work of Isaiah, it is the following of Christ. Thank you for your time and your patience.
Wow. Thank you so much, Daniel Castillo, for the inspiring presentation, for reminding us how sin disconnects us from our initial vocation and the need to take practical steps that will lead us to that messianic kingdom where nations shall not lift up sword against another nation. Thank you so much. So we will now invite the third presenter, Anna Blackman is a lecturer in Catholic religious education at the University of Glasgow and has taught widely in the areas of Catholic social thought, Christian ethics, Christian apologetics, and political theology. Anna's research focuses primarily on the intersection between Catholic theology and Catholic social thought and practice. She is interested in how Catholic social thought can be integrated in the wider body of Catholic theology, forming a holistic approach between the doctrinal and the social. In particular, she is concerned with how we can learn from grassroots faith-based movements and organizations, viewing praxis as already theological. Her doctorate focuses on this in specific relation to the Catholic worker movement, presenting a theology of praxis. Of specific concern is what such socio-political movements can teach the Church about how to best engage with the poor and marginalized, as well as how more normative theological voices often further isolate these groups. So Anna, we invite you now to share your presentation with us, and you have 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Lilian. And thank you both to the previous speakers as well. I've learned a lot this evening. Thank you to everyone organising and also to everyone watching. So as Lilian was saying, my background is in Catholic social teaching, and I began focusing mainly on grassroots activism. And it was really through this that I came to see the importance of ecology. So with working with groups like the Catholic Worker, and I was primarily drawn to that through the work they were doing with homeless and refugees, and also their activist work towards governmental policies. I really came to see how they were living very simply, in line with ecological principles. And it really struck me seeing this, how intertwined it was with solidarity, how intertwined it was, with ecological, the ecological intertwined with true solidarity with the marginalized, and how they go hand in hand. And I think this is really deeply reflected in Pope Francis' statements in Laudato Si, that the cry of the earth is joined to the cry of the poor. So in this talk today, I'll be putting on the theological and biblical themes that the previous speakers have spoken about, and really exploring this particularly in relation to Catholic social teaching, and especially in Laudato Si. So just a little bit of background to Catholic social teaching, in case anyone's not familiar. Although the church has always had some form of social teaching, and we see this obviously in the biblical sources that our two previous speakers have drawn on, Catholic social teaching is seen as the official body of thought, coming from the papacy, that attempts to reflect on, it began with reflecting on modernity and the social problem. So really our shared life within society in light of the Catholic tradition. And there's special focus here on addressing issues of structural injustice, like Daniel spoke about, harm the dignity of the human person. So within this, care for creation is obviously becoming an increasing central concern. And this has been touched on in papal documents since at least 1971, when Paul VI spoke about this, in his apostolic letter, Octogesima Adveniens. And since then, CST has aimed to address these concerns rooted in the biblical tradition. So we see this as developing within Catholic social teaching. John Paul II developed this theme in his writings, drawing heavily on the creation narrative, emphasizing traditional concepts such as the special task of stewardship for creation granted to humanity, and also how humanity expresses the image of God through participating in this creative work. Again, we also see this in Pope Benedict's work, emphasizing this ideas of God's gift of creation as being for the whole human family, so for shared use. So this really kind of speaks to the themes of systematic injustice, in which rich nations monopolize resources that are meant to be distributed equally. So we can see here how selfishness, greed of more affluent countries disproportionately affects those in less wealthy nations, causing migration, displacement, increasing violence, and obviously exacerbating the ecological crisis. So when we think about this, we're responding to this displacement, or often how people respond to this displacement is not with understanding or acceptance of our role, but often with violence as well, in order to protect these resources, ones that we already have control over or ones that we want to gain as these become diminished. One of the criticisms levelled at CST, however, and maybe we can talk about this in the discussion too, is that it's too anthropocentric. So it focuses on environmental damage, but in relation to how it affects humanity. And one of the arguments here has been that it fails to value nature in its own right, so focusing on human stewardship rather than the significance of things like the incarnation for the whole world. However, though, I think we really have seen this develop within Catholic social teaching, particularly in Laudato Si, that we can't really separate out this care for each other and care for creation. And Pope Francis' encyclical is really the first one to seriously address humanity's relationship with its wider environment in a sustained way. So as Father Emmanuel has spoken about, Pope Francis draws on the creation narrative, in which Adam and Eve are banished from the garden, and he argues how this demonstrates how our relationship with God, each other, and creation are all ruptured through sin. And due to this, this is a quote from Laudato Si, the originally harmonious relationship between human beings and nature has become conflictual. And again, reflecting on this story of Cain and Abel, as Daniel's spoken about, Pope Francis illustrates how violence towards each other and violence towards earth is linked. So he speaks here about how envy led Cain to commit this ultimate injustice against his brother, which in turn ruptured the relationship between Cain and God and between Cain and the earth from which he was banished. So here we see, again, as Daniel spoke about, this creation of unjust structural systems that oppress both. And Pope Francis speaks about this as the violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. Francis is really clear here to denounce a technocratic mindset that views the world in terms of its usefulness for consumption by humanity, speaking of nature as having its own value in God's eyes. He's also aware of Christianity's role in perpetuating a myth of human domination, insisting that nowadays we must forcefully reject the notion that our being created in God's image and being given dominion over the earth justifies absolute domination over other creatures, and that the Bible has no place for a tyrannical anthropocentrism. And this allows him to draw on deeper theological themes in terms of anthropology and Christology that work in conjunction. But he states that every element of creation gives glory to God by their very existence. So he's placing a value on creation through God's love for it, and that his loving plan in which every creature has its own value and significance, situating the whole of creation within God's plan. And we find a similar idea here within eco-theology, and this is an idea of deep incarnation. So this is the idea that embeds the incarnation within the creation narrative, so that Jesus' redemptive work restores the whole of creation, not just humanity. So not only is the incarnation here an affirmation of humanity, but it's also an affirmation of creation and the natural world. So God becomes embodied in creation. And we see this in Laudato Si with implications of what Pope Francis talks about as a universal or sublime communion. So as God creates through the word, so through Christ, everything, humanity and nature alike, finds its ultimate destiny in Christ. And Francis develops his thinking here in terms of integral ecology, which shows how injustice in humanity and injustice towards the earth are inherently intertwined, and speaks in these terms of the cry on the earth and the cry of the poor. So what harms the earth harms us, and vice versa. So this view of integral ecology links the care of the natural world with justice for the poor and for the vulnerable. For Francis, this is part of a larger cultural crisis, so it's moral, not just a purely physical problem. So it therefore calls for a moral solution, a change of mentality, not just a purely material response. And it's here where he speaks about a call to ecological conversion. And this suggests, again a quote from Laudato Si, that human life is grounded in these three fundamental relationships: with God, with our neighbour, and with the earth itself. So each of these aspects need to be readdressed to work towards a sustainable peace and justice. What I think is really quite important here is that part of realising our own dignity is also realising the dignity of creation. So we need to learn to encounter God in creatures outside itself. Again, a quote from Francis. And this is necessary as it's through the world, so through God's creation, that we journey towards God. This is how we experience as human beings situated within the world. So we further realise our personhood in relationship with God, not just from relationships with each other, but also through creation. But here, through this encounter, we get a deeper understanding and contemplation on creation, but also on what it means to be human. And I think this particularly, to me, relates to this connection to nonviolence. So if we think of the act of creation, it's this inherently nonviolent act. It's this outpouring of divine love from a relational Godhead made up of this communion of three persons whose love is shared with all of creation. So being made in the image of God, the image of sort of the true humanity or true anthropology, is to reflect this reciprocal loving relationship. So violence towards each other and towards the earth is a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be human. Francis says that concern for the environment thus needs to be joined to a sincere love for our fellow human beings and an unwavering commitment to resolving the problems of society. And he says that a deep communion with the rest of nature cannot be real if our hearts lack tenderness, compassion, and concern for our fellow human beings. And I think this is really essential for moving forward if we're thinking about how to combat the environmental crisis. So any approach here needs to be one of global solidarity and cooperation. We can't restore harmony to the earth if we don't have harmony amongst ourselves. And without this, the climate crisis is only going to exacerbate violence, battle over resources. And just to sort of finish on this note, Francis speaks about this in Laudato Si, calling us to a new and universal solidarity. So it's this idea of being marked by a holistic view of nonviolence that extends to all of creation. And hopefully this is what we will see, or I'm hoping this is what we will see more of in Laudato Si. So the next, what's being called Laudato Si Part 2, that Pope Francis is going to release on the 4th of October. And again, maybe this is something that we might want to think about in our discussion. So I'll hand back over to you, Lilian. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna, for the thought-provoking presentation and for reminding us about the new encyclical that will be coming out in the next few days as a continuation of the discussion that is already going on in relation to Laudato Si. So thank you so much, the three presenters, for the presentation. So we will now go to question and answer. We have a question that came up in the chat, and we invite Daniel Kichocho from University of Dayton to unmute and share her question.
Hi there. I'll go ahead and start my video. Pardon me. I'm in my kitchen, but I'm participating nonetheless. Hi, I'm from the University of Dayton, and I really enjoyed these presentations. I am a Chamorro scholar from the island of Guahan. So one of the questions I would love to get some perspective on comes from this idea that lots of this is based in, I don't want to say assumptions because I don't want to, like be combative, but I think we're coming from particularly like a Christian theology. So I guess my question is, because it's possible to argue that there is sort of inherent tension in studying environmental justice from a Christian theological perspective, how do speakers recommend we reconcile that tension? So how can we achieve a wider understanding of what theology is? And how can we understand that in the context of some environmental justice practices that predate some of these histories of imperialism?
So we invite the speakers to respond to the question.
Hello? Okay, thank you, Daniela, for the question. I can just speak briefly and then the others can say. I totally agree. Theology does not speak with one voice. There have been also some controversial theological ideas that have contributed to the crisis that we are in. So, but the way out of that is not to vacate theology altogether. I think the way out of that is to give a good reading of theology, a good theological account. And that may be resistant from some, but nevertheless, I think that is the primary task, especially for us Christians, to recover a good theological account of our relationship with God, with one another, and with the rest of creation. Without such a good theological account, I think we are going to let bad theology dominate the day. theology that has been already captured with bad, tyrannical or inadequate, misplaced anthropocentrism. So we need to do a better job kind of providing a good theological account.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for that response. I'm wondering if the other speakers have something to add.
I think it's a really good question. I think I agree with what Emmanuel was saying. I think probably two things. I think building on what Emmanuel was saying, I think because, and I think Pope Francis is quite open about this, because there has been sort of this bad theology around it, I think it's actually quite important, or almost gives more responsibility to reflect on it and offer a different account to sort of help resolve the situation, offer an alternative. And I think also it means listening to other traditions too that perhaps have got it right. So, and I think listening to Indigenous communities is very important. I think, again, Pope Francis has done this, and that's really hopeful. And I think perhaps a sort of a broader response to your question about maybe sort of the imperialism of coming from a particular standpoint in general. I think if you're situated within a tradition, it's quite hard to get out of that. But I think it doesn't mean that there's not anything to offer. So I think you can still have these dialogues, but in an open discussion, perhaps, and in an open way where you are listening to each other. And I think that's probably key.
Thank you, Anna, for that response. Daniel Castillo, would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, if I'll probably end up just reiterating a couple of points, but I mean, we certainly, the conversation has been limited because we're all explicitly working out of the Christian tradition and trying to name the work of Christian theology, right, is the work of trying to accurately name sin and grace at work in the world. And it's at least part of it. And communities of faith and theologians and people who are appropriating faith for just kind of instrumentalized reasons do a bad job of naming sin and grace, and often invert the name good evil and evil bad, and evil good. And so the work of theology from a committed point of view, right, is, as Emmanuel said, not to abandon the narratives, not to abandon the symbols that have been abused or mishandled or interpreted in problematic ways throughout history, but to work to reclaim them so that communities of Christian faith might have an identity other than that of tyrant and oppressor and colonizer. But the last word I said actually gets to what I think is the deepest problem, and I think the question was hinting at that. It's not just a history of the Christian tradition interpreting, understanding understanding humanity's relationship to creation in violent ways. It's tied up in the last 500 years in the 500-year project of Western extractive colonialism and Western Christianity's, the dominant kind of refrains of Western Christianity's ways it's been bound up in that project. And so the work that I would suggest Pope Francis is doing, and we're in our small ways doing here, is trying to think about how to decolonize the Christian imagination so that it can be of service to that work. It's a long, hard process. And but the last thing I'll say is to echo Anna's point that part of that work of decolonizing is entering into interreligious dialogue with humility, entering into intercultural dialogue with humility, which I think he's limited because everyone's limited, but Pope Francis has set a good example of that in the various dialogues he's entered into thus far in his papacy.
Thank you for the interesting responses to the question. We still have time for more questions. If you have any question, feel free to raise your hand so that our presenters can respond to your question.
If I can ask a question, I wonder what Anna and Emmanuel think about the idea of an implicit image of God anthropology at work in Genesis 2. So in Genesis 1, we're told kind of explicitly that God creates the human person in the image and likeness of God. But as Emmanuel was noting in his presentation, God is the first gardener, and there's a different verb used, so we could kind of maybe suggest that that connotes the difference between God and the human. But if God is the first gardener and God calls humanity to the vocation of gardener, then it's precisely through serving and caring and preserving, again, our animality, our relationship to the soil. It's precisely in that service and care that we most fully enter into the image and likeness of God. I don't know if that rings true or... Oh, you're muted, Emmanuel.
Forgetting. Am I okay now? Okay. Well, thank you, Daniel, for making that explicit. Actually, I was going to say when I mentioned the connection with the vocation, I was going to say the parallels that actually I see between Genesis chapter 2 and Genesis chapter 1. One of them is the delight that I mentioned, the garden in the east called the Eden, which is delight. It is another short form of God seeing is good, is pleasing, which is a refrain of Genesis chapter 1. But I was also, and I'm glad that you point that out, I was also going to highlight, I should have highlighted the way that this Genesis chapter 2, from the very start, presents us with a kind of God having this love affair with the creation, creating out of the soil and so forth, planting a garden and all that, and then gives man the vocation to precisely do the same, which is another parallel of being created in the image, in the image of God, that intimate relationship that is there. And Genesis 1 itself, in terms of the last line that have been used to kind of also suggest a kind of dominion, be masters and things like that, I feel, and Pope Francis points that out, that there is a misreading of that line, be masters and so forth, and that kind of connects it because we are made in the image of God. What I see going on in that whole text of Genesis chapter 1, the creation of the world, and God said, and so it was beautiful, and God was pleased, the whole account of beauty, orderliness, the whole account of harmony that is there, that this is all part of the package when man is invited, when man is created in the image of God. It's an invitation also to exercise the same harmony and beauty and relationship in a way, not a conflictual relationship with the creation, but that sense of harmonious relationship. So there is a lot of parallels that I think one can draw attention to, but I'm glad that you really highlight that connection between the vocation and the being made in the image and likeness of God. Thank you.
I'm just going to begin this by saying biblical studies is not my specialty, but I think yeah, so, I mean, I think definitely within Catholic social teaching, the idea of stewardship is very, very important. But I think something that Emmanuel touched on is this idea of I think what you did really well, Daniel, is actually thinking about what does it mean about the image of God, because I think often that's been misunderstood as being in the image of God, we somehow have ownership over creation. So I think drawing out that vocation and the care and the harmony is really important, actually. And I really, the image of gardener, I loved that you drew that in and brought it back to Jesus, just to sort of give that fuller picture. So I think that is something quite important to think about. But I don't actually know. I mean, I think I'm thinking about sort of the work of John Paul II. I think he does that in relation to work. So being part of God's creative process in terms of work and how we reflect that. But I think actually drawing that out in creation, in terms of creation and nature, is really important. And yeah, I found that very illuminating, what you did for drawing that together. So thank you.
I have a question, and this more specifically to Daniel. I think that was fascinating what you pointed out about Cain fleeing from the work of the garden and going to live in the city, or building a city, the first city. And you asked us to not think about this city in terms of urban space, but in terms of civilization or something like that. Structure. So what do you make of the accounts that I've heard, many of these accounts that say where there is a progression, the woman is made in Genesis chapter 2 in the garden, things like that, and then the book of Revelation ends with a New Jerusalem, a new city coming down from heaven. I've seen people actually making the comment that urban space is part of the design of God, and that actually the telos, the final eschaton, is going to be all of us living in the cities and things like that. So I don't know what you make of that, and how to make sense of that final reading of, of the eschaton in terms of urban space.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question. What I would say in my own thought and my reading of scripture and the tradition is that yes, it's a city. So humans as kind of producers of culture, right? As cultivators of culture, as cultivators of political ecologies, right? As systems so that we live, of civilization, that we are called to do that work, to in effect build cities. But right, the city that Cain builds, it's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's the city of Pharaoh, it's the city of Babylon, it's the city of Caesar. And at its heart, right, is then the kind of the lust, the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the way that I kind of understand it, that I've presented it. The work I think we're called to then is not to try and, I mean, sometimes it is take apart the system, take apart the city, like you're called out of Pharaoh's Egypt, right? But it's to work for the city, for the systems of political ecology that have the tree of life at their center, that have that the organizing principle, like the Garden of Eden, right, is the wisdom of God, which is tree of life is symbolic of, and that wisdom is expressed, right, in God's very call to humanity to serve and care. So if we're creating systems and structures and civilizations that serve and care for the soil and all that come from the soil, which is always going to be limited, always going to be ambiguous, always going to be fragmented in our world today, that is the work of participating again in salvation, in bearing witness to God's desire to redeem the world. And that's what we see in the book of Revelation, right? Is on both sides of the river it's not the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's on both sides of the river are the tree of life. So it's the city transformed in accordance by and in accordance with the wisdom of God.
Yeah.
This is my read.
Thank you very much for the responses you give to one another. So there is a question in the chat from Annie Killian. Annie, would you be willing to unmute yourself?
Hello, thank you for these presentations. And my question is very similar to what you were just discussing, but I was also struck by the connection between Cain and founding cities and the violence of cities. And Pope Francis talks a lot about urban neighborhoods with poverty and kind of ecological destruction together. So I was just wondering about how we build urban spaces that promote nonviolent and sustainable living. Thank you.
I suspect actually some of the talks that come in later weeks may pick up on this theme in a more robust way. Let me answer your question by putting it in a much broader framework. That the political ecological degradation that Francis does in fact name in urban spaces are part of a broader city, if you will. As I already kind of alluded to, the 500-year project of Western extractive colonialism has worked to take spaces that are marginal to the center of the system and reduce the land there, the life of the earth there, to commodity of land, to extract resources, and then the lives of the human persons there to the non-person, or to tool to extract the wealth from those spaces. And so when we're thinking about any kind of spatial arrangement today, I think we need to take seriously the enduring legacies, the afterlives of colonialism and white extractive male kind of colonizing. So within that, then, I think about looking at, so I'll just name one thing, thinking about my own context, and maybe that is the most appropriate way to go about answering a really tricky and complex question, is the example of redlining in Baltimore, right? Where BIPOC communities, non-white communities, and persons and families and communities in Baltimore were systematically cut out from the wealthiest neighborhoods, were prevented from buying houses there, were prevented from accruing wealth in these manners, and were systematically kind of cordoned off to spaces that were then subsequently neglected and underinvested in. That this kind of analysis, and then thinking about, well, what are the environmental implications of that, is a way into thinking about what is the work of the gardener in a particular urban space. So looking at questions of environmental racism, looking at questions of investment and care for the soil might be a way in. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Daniel, for that response. We have one more question from Dayton University, if the person would be willing to unmute herself.
Hi, I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Way to represent University of Dayton. So I'm very happy that you guys are talking so much about the way that the climate crisis is a spiritual crisis, not just technological and scientific. That's certainly a big theme in Laudato Si. But I'm wondering if you'd say more like what spiritual means in that, because it can sound like this is just a crisis that's in the heart then, or in the mind. And it seems like a spiritual crisis really is about the way we live as well. And so I was very interested, particularly to get Anna to talk about this, thinking about the theology implicit in the practice of communities. Do you know communities who are living in a way that really embodies a different spirituality? Thanks.
I can begin by just kind of talking a little bit about the spiritual, as I understand it, and then I'll pass it on to Anna to talk more about, if you don't mind. When Pope Francis says that underlying the crisis of our time lies a wound, and he also calls it a sin. It's a sin that we have forgotten what it means to belong, to be part. We see the word and the earth as distinct, as different out there. And that is connected to our desire to exploit and things like that. So the way I understand spiritual is not, this is not some kind of piety that he's talking about. This is not that's kind of just a sentiment that is just in the heart. But it gets to some fundamental questions of belonging. Who am I? Where do I belong in the order of the universe and the creation? What's my role? What's my goal in life? How do I relate to others and spiritual, or sorry, non-material, but also immediate neighbors? So these are very immaterial, non-material questions in a way that define identity, that define belonging, that define one's sense of purpose in life, meaning. But these, in a way, structure and shape the concrete practices that we live with. So it's not that they are not connected to, that they're completely separate from, okay, our lives here that we go on day-to-day basis and so forth. At the basis of that are these non-material questions that we have either not settled or have settled in a particular way. If we think, for example, or that we are different from the rest of creation there, so then we see the rest of creation there as just mere matter that can be exploited, that's not part of us, then they just objects, mere nature. It doesn't prevent us from exploiting however best that we want. If we feel that we human beings have a special role as masters at dominion, as the one to exercise dominion and control, then it shapes the way that we live. But the questions themselves are deep questions of belonging, questions of identity, questions of meaning, that translate into very, very practical ways of living. And Anna, I think take up the question.
Anna, we are running short of time. If you can just make it to be brief so that we can conclude. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, great question. I think really agree with what Father Emmanuel was saying. So I think it's also to do with, we're thinking about theology and belief. Essentially, that's thinking about what's important, what do we hold sacred, what are our highest values. So Pope Francis is critiquing systems where the highest values here are based on competition, individualism, materialism, etc. So this is really where the conversion is coming from. So I wouldn't, it's not unconnected to the material, but I think it's the spiritual conversion that comes first. So seeing the flaws in the current systems, what's going wrong, and then making this inner change to try and do something differently. I think this is really important, especially when we're thinking about environmental problems, because cutting scientific, technological solutions aren't going to be sufficient. So we really need to cut our consumption and live simply if we want this to work. So consumption, demand for energy is still going up 2.5% every year. So it's just growing. So we really need to cut back and make this conversion to a simpler way of life. So I think we do see this being portrayed pretty well in a couple of different movements. I think the Catholic Worker is a pretty good one. Also see it obviously with Pax Christi. the Laudato Si movement, and obviously in secular organisations, so groups like Greenpeace. And in Scotland, in education in Scotland, which for my context, there is a really big push in schools to bring them in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, a really big push for outdoor learning as well, which is super great to see. And I think through education really enhances this change. I know we're short of time, so I won't go on too much. But if anyone else wants to jump in, Daniel, if you had anything to say, or Lilian.
In the interest of time, and I've said enough, I've spoken enough. I'll just allow Lilian to pick it up.
Thank you so much for your wonderful contributions. I now give the floor to Michelle to tell us how we will proceed for the next presentations in future.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. The hour and a half passed by so quickly. So we say thank you so much to our three presenters and moderators, Father Emmanuel, Dr. Anna, Dr. Daniel, Lilian, Sister Lilian, new doctor, Sister Lilian Ehidiamhen. So we say thank you so much to all who joined this evening, especially our international participants. I noticed Canada, England, Scotland, and the Philippines were all present here, as well as our colleges and universities across the US, and especially the watch party from University of Dayton. Thank you so much for all who asked questions this evening. And we would also like to thank our sponsors. So I'm going to put their logos up on the screen right now for us, just to express gratitude to them. Next week, we have another exciting panel with the speakers here that you will see, and our topic next week is moving from the foundations of theology into the multifaceted realities of environmental violence. And we are especially excited to welcome both international and US speakers again for this second week. And so we hope that you will join us tomorrow, next week, Monday, same time, or Tuesday, if you're in the Philippines. Everyone will be receiving the recording link, which is on Facebook Live, and also study guides. So every week we will be putting together study guides based on questions from our speakers that colleges and universities can use again and again and again. There are other ways to get involved, so I'm just going to go quickly through those. The first one is we have a Pax Christi Young Adult Caucus that you heard mentioned before. Both Elian and I are part of this group. It is for peacemakers in our 20s and 30s. And so we will put those links in the chat. Thank you so much. And then this weekend on Saturday, October 7th, we will have a virtual retreat that is co-sponsored by Pax Christi USA, the Bergamo Center for Lifelong Learning in Dayton, Ohio, and the Marianist Social Justice Collaborative. So you can register for that online. It is $10, and we also have scholarships available. And then I'm going to turn it over to Elian to share about EcoCare Now.
Thank you. Another way to get involved is to partner with us, EcoCare Now. What we do is we partner with Black, Indigenous, and women of color at the grassroots level to address the most pressing ecological issue that impacted community disproportionately. So we're looking at climate change, but also violence against women's environmental human rights defender. So you don't need to be a Black, Indigenous, or woman of color to join. You could also be an ally, and I have put the membership and ally interest form in the chat box. You could also scan the QR codes on the screen with your phone to be able to join the movement. So once again, we would like to thank you all for joining us today. And if you are in the Philippines, good morning. If you are elsewhere, good night, and see you next week. Thanks.